Okay, we're going to jump into the SVOD market. Even though this conversation is focused primarily on advertising, I think everyone realizes that SVOD is very much competition for eyeballs. Over the last year or so, we've seen Disney launch a global assault on Netflix's global business. I'm not trying to talk about this competition as if it's a zero-sum game where one obliterates the other and the other doesn't exist. But which of the two companies do you think is the most likely contender at the moment to come out on top as the global leader for SVOD?
Well, the thing about SVOD is that what was clear before the pandemic became crystal clear during the pandemic, that the best entertainment television is being done on SVOD, and that traditional broadcast and cable channels are no longer the place to go for the highest quality television. And that's Netflix, that's Disney Plus, that's HBO Max, that is even Hulu, which does have an AVOD component, but is SVOD in the sense that to get it at all, you have to pay a subscription fee, even though there's a lower price for those who are willing to take ads. And the combination of all of that viewing, coupled with some lesser SVOD streaming services like Showtime, and it creates a situation where while there's a lot of focus on AVOD, one has to question between the existing linear world, which certainly is suffering from substantial cord cutting and decline in audiences, but is still, but in the United States, traditional cable and satellite is over 60% of homes. And when you add skinny bundles into that, so-called digital skinny bundles that are still carrying the linear television channels, that's over 70% of homes. And you add that to the SVOD, no advertising support, the AVOD world, with all the focus it gets, is still pretty small. And there's a big question there, I think, when we peel through the reality of how big the AVOD market's going to be, something that really is not getting quite as much focus among media analysts as it should. To your question on Netflix versus Disney, I went out on CNBC recently, and at the time of Netflix last earnings report a couple weeks ago, which was, in my mind, truly outstanding, confirmed what I thought, though I thought this earnings report confirmed it, that Netflix will be by far the most valuable media company in the world. And that isn't to say that Disney is not going to be a meaningful competitor in the SVOD streaming wars. And it doesn't mean that the Disney global brand isn't going to be a way for Disney to be probably head and shoulders among others who are trying to transform their linear media companies into the digital streaming world. But Netflix just has a superior business model, one, and two, its success involves no downside baggage. What you got to remember about Disney, and it's true for all the traditional players that are trying to transform themselves, the disruption that they suffer as a result of streaming, including their own efforts, accelerate the decline of their linear business. And so success in streaming brings with it real downdraft that has to be taken into account relative to the ultimate value of those companies. With Netflix, streaming success is all success without that factor.
Yeah. Do you think Netflix will seek alternative sources of revenues in order to generate that growth? I mean, advertising is one thing that we frequently talk about, and speculate about. It never seems to happen. And I've been told before by Netflix that it won't happen for quite some time, if it happens at all, or if it does, it might be a different brand. Do do you feel that they have to grow? I mean, you talk about the baggage of Disney, but there's also assets and established, merchandising and all those type of things, those other revenue sources. Do you think Netflix will ultimately go down a similar path to generate growth, or will its current model be enough?
Well, its current model is incredibly strong, and I don't think they would or should go down the path of advertising unless, as you say, it's a totally different brand. Because the price value perception of Netflix is astoundingly strong. And, it's not just that Disney Plus has about half the subs at about half the ARPU. It is the engagement in programming time that Netflix is able to generate is probably 5 times or more greater than Disney Plus in the homes that they're both in. And it is the buzziness of Netflix original programming. So they've been able to continue to raise price, demonstrating that they have a very substantial perception of value. Part of that value is that you don't have to wade through commercials. They have a budget that is putting pressure on the entirety of the rest of the industry, including Disney, which basically started off when it announced its streaming plans, talking about something in the area of a budget of $4 billion, which under pressure from Netflix and what it means to be in this global game has already been brought up to about $8 billion. But Netflix this year is probably going to be 17 to 18 billion on its way to a $20 billion programming budget. Now, when you stop and consider what a $20 billion a year programming budget means, it means that it can probably introduce a new movie or a new television series each and every day. And that creates an ability to hold your audience, not churn. And remember, churning in a digital environment is a whole lot easier than it was in the cable satellite world, where disconnect is much more of a difficult proposition. And Netflix's ability to create that greater engagement through its programming budget, its ongoing price value perception, its ability to continue to raise price, and then 2 other elements. One, real strong international distribution. There was a lot of focus on Disney's headline number of subscribers, and they've done very well out of the box with subscribers, no doubt. But about a third of those subscribers come from Hotstar in India, where the ARPU is probably well under $1 versus a average ARPU for Netflix in the $10 to $11 range or around the globe. And if Netflix had, when people looked under the hood, had that much of its growth coming from very small ARPU India subs, people would have screamed holy murder about, oh my God, Netflix can't be worth anything close to what people say it is. And yet with Disney, it was hardly taken note by investors who looked at the headline number and basically weren't focused on the fact that those are pretty limited ARPU subs. Moreover, much of that India audience comes from sports, which are rights that Disney rents, doesn't own. It's not innate to the Disney brand type of distribution. So a lot of differences relative to Netflix, which has done such an incredible job of local production and driving local content in the form of originals in various markets, where Disney's strategy, at least to date, seems to be focused on the Disney well-known brands, Star Wars, Marvel, etc., without really getting into distinctive localization of product. And so you put all that together, and it is very hard, particularly given the linear downdraft that Disney has to manage, to look at that and say that they're even comparable business models. Yes, Disney does have certain ways of generating revenue through merchandising and parks, and Netflix doesn't have that. And if there is one area that I see Netflix getting into, I could see them getting into merchandising given the strength of some of their shows. Imagine if in the Queen's Gambit, chess branded Queen's Gambit chess sets, given the huge global uptick in chess buying that took place following the release of that show. There are some clear ways that they can drive a different source of revenue through that kind of activity.
And what about the other players? You're all friends at NBC and Comcast. Peacock has come fairly strong out of the blocks so far. They've had a good start, I think. Do you not place much faith in models like that for building out the AVOD market?
Well, it's not that I don't think that Peacock is a pretty interesting model when you have the largest cable operator in the United States being able to push that out, and alliances with other cable operators pushing that out. And it's a free in a lot of those markets, and small pay in markets where that may not be the case. And, it's actually done a very good job with its initial distribution. People lose sight of the fact that with the big headline numbers of how many subs Disney has, including its India subs, in the United States, it has 35 million subs, which is not a small task. But Peacock, which launched much more recently, and certainly has not put quite the programming budget by any means behind it, is probably in the high 20 range of subscribers. And so against that comparison, Disney's probably not done quite as well as people really believe it has, Disney Plus in the US, and Peacock's probably done better. I think the issue with the AVOD market is how many players are in there. And as I said, given the linear world coupled with the SVOD world, and I didn't include Amazon when I was discussing the SVOD world, and what Amazon can do potentially with advertising, as YouTube, which next to Netflix is the second largest garner of streaming audience in the US. And obviously that's a advertising market that is principally one that others don't participate in really. And so you have your biggest advertiser supported streaming media audience, not really what I would count up for grabs in the AVOD market that people have to think about. And then when you consider what that AVOD market is, it's I think largely going to be dominated by Hulu on, again, a hybrid SVOD AVOD service. You're going to have Peacock in there. You are supposedly going to have an HBO Max advertising version in there. Then you get into these bundles of free streaming services like Tubi and Pluto, and you then have the Roku channel, which is a component of the Roku mix, and you put what a small slice AVOD may be of future viewing, and how many participants there are in that market, and everybody can't end up with huge multi-billion-dollar valued businesses, I think, off the back of that.
Yeah. Let's stay on that topic of valuations, because we started off speaking about the stimulus, and I think one of the sort of results of that has been that there's been lots of cash flying around, and people have been, particularly retail investors, have been investing in the stock markets, and we've seen all sorts of very entertainingly crazy valuations. Do any in particular jump out to you in our space, particularly in the sort of media and advertising space, as being more overvalued than most?
Well, it's in a market with 0 to negative interest rates, and all kinds of monetary stimulus and all kinds of fiscal stimulus, as I mentioned. It's very hard to know what the value of any company really is against that backdrop. And I think anything that looks like it's been grown during the pandemic has gotten an extra boost. And in streaming media, you have a view that this is just accelerated secular change, and those companies are going to come out even stronger. And so they're getting a back to normal boost as well. But I look at something like Roku, which is clearly establishing itself as a clear device winner in the streaming world, certainly in the United States, and beginning to show opportunity internationally in that regard. But device manufacturer margins don't really make you a $55 billion business. And that's basically gotten its valuation over the prospects of its ad sales. It takes a piece of the bounty when it sells subscriptions on its platform, but most of that is viewed on the growth of AVOD. Now, if you look at the world today, where I do believe SVOD is only going to get more competitive in terms of taking audience share because of the budgets that are continuing to grow in a way that the best of programming and more original programming, and Netflix moving to an original movie or series every day. I have a hard time seeing, against that backdrop, AVOD audiences growing that substantially. Certainly the continued decline of linear advertising will help it some, but you look today where Roku's had a early lead, and it's got about 1% of streaming minutes, which is probably less than 0.5% of all television time watched. Now, in the United States, a cable channel that had 0.5% of viewing would have a hard time with a pretty good model where half of its money was coming in through advertising and half through subscriber fees that had total flow-through margin compared to advertising, where your margin on ad dollars is considerably less. Something that had a half of a 1% rating could be worth $3 billion, $5 billion, maybe. And now we're talking about something that's worth $53 billion. So there's a lot of hopes built up in terms of how investors are looking at what the value is of a device that can leverage substantial amount of inventory from those that want to get on its device to the television set. And yes, that's a meaningful role to play in the future television ecosystem. Is it anywhere close to 53 billion? If it's based off the back of advertising revenues, I have a hard time getting there.
I mean, if you could play God and you were given full power to do whatever you wanted with the international TV industry, and you're given a mandate to, come up with a solid AVOD opposition, what would be the first thing you would do? Is it simply that consolidation is required in order for all these different companies to survive, or is there still perhaps strength in producing more localized content? Maybe a local Swedish company will be able to provide, they'll just provide a different type of service that's more localized, where they have more, understanding of cultural nuances and things like that.
Well, if my analysis is right, that there's going to be, the linear television world is still going to garner meaningful audience. The SVOD world is going to continue to drive huge budgets, which are going to drive massive amounts of the streaming audience in the SVOD world. And AVOD, against that backdrop, is going to be more and more splintered as more and more free streaming linear channels come into the mix, and overall amount of time spent on AVOD services is not going to substantially grow. Again, putting YouTube and Hulu AVOD in a separate bucket, and some of the big guys like Peacock or HBO Max advertising being able to substantially drive the high end of the AVOD market. Given what's left, you really, if you can't do it on volume, you got to do it on pricing. And to do it on pricing, you got to do a hell of a job with targeting. And I'm not sure the AVOD world, which has gotten a lot of money flowing into it, and most of the gains it's had has been actually in volume so far, not in pricing, because the growth of just more and more homes cutting the cord, getting a streaming device, having access to streaming television has increased the audience against which AVOD opportunities can be presented. I think a lot of it is going to have to be off the back of price, and targeting has to improve immensely. And television has never done a good job of really developing great targeted advertising where you're going well beyond demos and you're really getting at the essential ingredients of how an audience can be dissected to deliver a degree of efficiency which will justify far superior pricing. Now, the problem with that is that the better your targeting gets, you got to worry about what happens to the rest of that audience that gets sold in a traditional linear environment against demographics that in a targeting world you can't totally discard because there may not be that many truly efficient targets within any particular slice of linear of streaming AVOD audience. And so within that, there are pricing dynamics that really need to get some sophisticated treatment. But in the end of the day, look, I'm chairman of Captify. Captify has probably got more targeting juice than anyone because it's all built off the back of the largest reservoir of search data that exists in the world other than Google. And with that, search being such a better indication of intent and desire and the journey of a consumer than anything else. But bringing that kind of data into the AVOD world to increase the superiority of targeting, to me, is going to be essential for AVOD to really reach the kind of valuations that people are putting against it.
Tom, we're out of time. And yeah, it's been an absolute joy as always. Thanks so much for taking the time.
Thanks for having me. Great to see you.
Cheers. Pleasure.